Welcome to this Writing Center workshop. You know, we tried to cluster the on-campus folks here at these three tables and make it a little cozier. And we also have some people attending online live, and I know we'll have some people watching the recording too. Welcome to this workshop. I'm Michelle Rogie Gannon. I direct the Writing Center. I want to encourage you as you're working on your papers, whether it's a literature review or something else, to come to the Writing Center. We can help you with those assignments. Tonight is a special session. For one thing, it's a little bit longer, being an hour and a half. We have three presenters from different disciplines. We'll be talking about writing a literature review. We have John Dudley, Associate Dean, College of Arts and Sciences, also representing the English Department, the Humanities. James Hockelmeyer from the Department of Chemistry and representing the Hard Sciences. And Shane Nordyke for Political Science and representing Social Sciences. Oh, fantastic. If you can move a little, well, I guess now we're getting busier here, so you can probably stay at that table, that'd be fine. Okay. So if you haven't gotten some handouts, know that they're coming your way right now. This handout lists the remaining workshops, the goal handout. Next week, lab reports that you may not be so interested in that, but the one after it, revision strategies from thesis statements to flowing prose. Prentice Clark does an amazing job with that workshop. I would encourage you to attend. How to write a portfolio introduction. You might be doing that for a class. You may be interested in that workshop. And the last one is a write-in, which we hold from 7 to 11 that night, and you can just drop in with any kind of writing you're working on. We will have writing consultants on hand, several of them, and free food and drink. And so that's an opportunity. You can sit at a table and work on your writing, or tap a consultant on the shoulder and get help with your writing, get some feedback, other writing assistance. For the end of this workshop, we'll distribute comment cards and we'll provide a survey link for the online folks. On the comment card, be sure to let us know how this workshop went for you. And if you need an instructor or advisor notified that you were here, you can put that information on the comment card. The other sheet is general information about the Writing Center, including answers to commonly asked questions, has our contact information and our hours, and on the back side, information about how to schedule an appointment. Okay. So we're going to get started here with Professor Hockelmeyer.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. Do I need to go to the full screen display, or is this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. There you go.
There we go. All right. So I think when I see student writing, probably the number one thing, or maybe two things that I see oftentimes that I'd like to address right now are organization of the writing, and then picking the scope of the topic so that it's not too broad, so that you can actually, wrap your writing around the concept, and then thoroughly write about that concept in a well-organized way. This is writing a review workshop, so the kinds of works we're discussing tend to be quite large, yet it's important to focus carefully on your topic selection and not to pick something so broad that it's overwhelming and basically an impossible task to focus on. So, here I showed the infinite nature of the universe. We have to carve this up very carefully into your topic. Some other mistakes in writing a literature review, which we can sort of think about as we go along, are that and I think this point will come up in some of the other presentations, is that we're not simply writing a list of all the works that have been completed on a topic. We need to present something new when we're writing the review, maybe add a novel take or a novel idea on the topic. Otherwise, somebody's probably already written about it, and you can find the information in the literature. And so this is not simply an annotated bibliography. So this is how I like to picture idea space. This is just a representation. It doesn't mean I'm right or wrong. It's not the only way to view things, but I sort of like to think of ideas as dendritic in nature. They have origins. There are lots of influences that go into the formation of an idea, and then from an idea, as more people think about the idea, it may branch along in different directions and grow in different ways. Um, and so I tried to depict what that might look like with this sort of dendritic branching structure. And I highlighted some regions of this dendritic idea structure and how that might help you to think about what is a review, right? So some reviews may be exhaustive and completely encompass an entire branch of an idea and all works ever done on that idea. And something like this would be a vast undertaking. It might be an encyclopedic compendium of knowledge on the topic. It may be very many volumes of work, right? Um, and most of what you might be undertaking as students might be a shorter review article for a class, or maybe some of you are working on a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation. You'll need to create the introductory content of that document in which you start to define your work and, in essence, provide a little bit of a review in the field of interest so that you can define why your contributions are important. All right. So such a review might select some of the key works along a branch of idea in this idea tree and sort of stepwise show the evolution of the ideas from some origin up to the state of the art. Other types of reviews that you might find in the scientific literature are maybe annual progress in such and such topic. And so I highlighted the leading edge of this branch over here. Maybe that's all the work from the year 2017. And somebody decided to compile that into some sort of a work. Oftentimes when we write papers, so many of us are involved in research, and we need to publish our work in the peer review journal space, and the articles will have an introduction highlighting some of the important works in the field so that, again, you can show where your work fits in, why your work is a novel contribution. And so that's a short space to provide a little bit of an introduction on the topic. So you might hit up on a few of the key works in this along a branch of ideas. So it would certainly be shorter than, say, the introductory portion of a dissertation, but maybe an abbreviated version. A dated literature review might encompass an older part of the tree, whereas a more current literature review might be highlighting a more recent branch or group of ideas. And there are also sort of a popular mechanism for publishing are these micro reviews that I see appearing in the literature oftentimes, where you take a very recent development in the field that maybe hasn't been reviewed yet because the ideas are so rapidly emerging, and then just sort of group together the works and write about that in a micro review. So these tend to be very, very current. So those are the different kinds of documents that you might be interested in as graduate students working on review type works. What I wanted to go into next was I think it's very important as scientists to take advantage of the excellent search engines available to sift through the scientific literature. This is certainly a distinction in our fields. In the sciences, things are compiled very nicely in the Science Citation Index. So I wanted to show you how to access that and how to do some searches with the Science Citation Index. So I'll bring up a browser. Let's see what comes up here. Is this the space? So we can go to usd.edu. All right, so there's our USD homepage. At the last backslash, if you just add the word library, This will bring you to the library homepage. So there are all sorts of links and information on this page. It's a valuable resource, so please use it. Right here, just below this front center picture, you see a lot of tabs, and there's one for databases. And if I click into that, immediately below is alphabetical, the letters of the alphabet, links to alphabetized library database resources. So if I click on W, see at the top of the page here, the Web of Science Core Collection. So the Science Citation Index is an index, a vast index of the scientific literature, and this is run through Web of Science. So you can use your credentials to log in. So this will work for anybody who's a current student. And now we can begin a search. This is a powerful search tool because there are so many ways to slice and dice a search. So we can search by topic, titles of works, authors, and other parameters. Topic is probably, I think it's the most useful parameter because in sciences we're often writing about a concept. Maybe in the humanities we would follow an author and compile the works or something like that, but not so often in sciences. And so in our exercise, I wanted to show you how to do a search. So I suggest we type in the word metal, and we'll add an asterisk at the end. This would include metallic, metals, metal, all sorts of versions of the word metal. And then we'll add the word nano with another asterisk. So we're looking for metal. Could be nanoparticles, nanocrystals, nanostructures, nanomaterials, right? We want to keep it broad for now. And if we do that search, we come up with over 200,000 works on this topic. So a giant space, right? There's this very active field. And that's too much to deal with, right? So that would be a clue right there that the topic that you picked might be quite broad. So you might want to, you might want to narrow the search a little bit. And so maybe you're interested in branching nanostructures. So we can search within these hits, the 200,000 some odd hits, and we can type the word branch. We'll add an asterisk there for branching, branched, so on. And we can hit enter there to start that search. And now we have around 1,600 hits. It's still a lot, but this is a lot more manageable. And we've only used one parameter to reduce the number of hits in this search. All right. One of the things that you can do in the Science Citation Index is you can search by publication year, by discipline. So if you want chemistry, you can do that. Physics leaning articles, you can do that. You can search by document types. And I think if you're getting started on writing a review or getting to know a topic, it's really nice to find good review articles to help bring you up to speed on that topic. And so this is a really nice feature. I can click review documents and then further refine the search. It's telling me there's 116. So if I click refine, it will bring up those 116 hits. All right, so these are all reviews on branch, metal, nano, whatever it may be. All right, and then you can still sort through this list and get exactly the information you're looking for. So if you want current stuff from 2017, you can do that. One of the things I like to do is sort by the number of times the work was cited. Important works tend to be highly referenced in the science literature. So if we organize this or sort this, we will find what are likely influential or hot articles at the top of the list. And in my presentation, I highlighted this article entitled Metal Nanocrystals with Highly Branched Morphologies. That's a review article that I've enjoyed reading. I think it's, let's see. So it's this article right here. And And so you could read that one, and if you're interested in writing a review on branching metal nanostructures, this will get you up to speed on the topic. Now that shouldn't be your only source of information, but that will help. And maybe your review will be even more focused. After reading this, you might find that some ideas are emerging, like some applications of metal branching nanostructures in such and such, biomedical or catalysis or batteries or whatever it may be. And then that may be how you spin off your review. You take it a step further, okay? So I think that's what we look for in reviews, is not only compiling the key information, but maybe adding just a little bit of something new, the new direction of interest. I think that's important. All right. Okay. I think we're going to skip the bottom part of this, and then I wanted to mention Google Scholar in addition to the use of the Science Citation Index. But I'll just take a pause here. Are there any questions about Science Citation Index before moving on?
Wait, you put an asterisk, what does that mean? When you put the asterisk, that's search?
Right, so let's say I have the word metal. If I just type metal, it will only search the string of METAL. If it finds anything else, it will not come up in your search. If you add the asterisk after, it will search any string with METAL and anything after. So it could be metallic, metals, metallated, whatever version of metal you can think of. All of those will now be included in your search. So it's much broader. It catches more things, a bigger net. So that can be really useful. Or you don't use the asterisk if you want to restrict things to exactly the string, character string you want to search for. So I think that's a nice feature in the search. You can do Boolean searches, so you can do and, or, and I think they have some keys for doing that as well. So it's a good question. Anything else? All right. So let's open up another browser here. So if you just type the word Scholar into Google, you'll probably see a link for Google Scholar. And this one's becoming more important in the sciences. I think it's nice just because it's so simple, right? The Science Citation Index, one, it requires credentials. So if you're not associated with a university or subscribing, somebody subscribing to the Science Citation Index, you're out. So Google Scholar is open to anybody. So that's nice. It's quick, it's easy, but it's not as powerful in terms of arranging and sorting the information. And so we could enter the string branch metal nano again. All right, and you get over 200,000 hits. So this was even more hits than we saw in the Science Citation Index. So Google catches a lot of things. They're even more distant from the terms that you enter. They're not sorted in any rational way that I can see. But you can click these links here and sort, or at least cut the date range for the articles that pop up in the search. You can include patents and citations. You can remove that information. You can sort by date. One thing that's nice about the Google Scholar search is, see on the right here, you see these PDF links. A lot of times you see an article link, you can just click right there, boom, there's the article, it comes up as a PDF. Sometimes those are dead links and they don't work, but it's just so convenient when you can click something and the article pops right up. This is especially nice if this is a link to an article that the university library doesn't have access to that journal's e-subscription, so we don't have access to the library, so sometimes you can find the article in Google. Another feature is you can click on authors. So here's an author, Ping Gao, Peking University, and you can learn a little bit about what this author's working on. And so finding authors that are influential can often be helpful in your literature search. All right, so with that said, I really wanted to focus a lot of our attention on the search tools because sifting through the information is a big part of writing the literature review. So going back to my first comment about organization, once you have access to the information and you learn how to sift through it and find what you need, the next step is organization. You need to write an outline. If you start your writing with an outline, you will always be well organized from the outset, and that will improve your writing vastly. So please take that recommendation to heart. And I think with that, I'll go ahead and be finished with the presentation so we can allow the other speakers some time. I don't want to dominate. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer now, or we can wait to the end in more of a discussion type format. So is there anything now that, yeah?
Does Scholar have the SIFT by citation mode?
SIFT by citation. So it's not on the screen where I just did the search for branch metal nano. I did not see a link for searching by citations. However, if you click on an author, you can sort that by their publications by date, and you can sort those by number of citations. So you can find an author and find like their most important work in a matter of seconds. So that's, you can sort of see what are they known for, in other words. So that's one of the features. Anything else? All right, thank you.
Hi, I am Shane Nordyke. I'm a professor in the political science department, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the social sciences perspective to a lit review. And one of the great things about the way that they have put together this session is that you're going to be able to see meaningful differences in the way that we talk about lit reviews in our various disciplines, but you're also going to see there's quite a bit of commonality, and that we're going to say like many of the same things kind of in different ways, but to really drive the point home. One of the things I wanted to mention that we didn't explicitly point out about Google Scholar, since we were just looking at that page, is the utility of the cited by that's underneath of an article. So it's like the opposite of the reference list that's at the end of an article. So if you're wanting to find other people who have cited this particular work to see where research has gone since that work was published, that's really useful. So you can use the references list to move backwards and then use the cited by to move forward, and that can often help you to find things that you're looking for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we write lit reviews, and then I'm going to talk about some of the mechanics of actually sitting down and organizing the material and doing the writing. So Dr. Hoffelmau did a great job about finding sources, and I'm going to just kind of jump into more like, okay, let's assume you already have figured out which sources you have. Now, what do you do with them? How do you organize them to where it turns into something that's really a good lit review? And good lit reviews perform a variety of functions. And depending on whether it's the introduction to a short journal article, or it's the introduction to your dissertation or thesis, or maybe it's just a review article in and of itself, they'll look a little bit different. But generally, they all have these same characteristics. First is that you're demonstrating that, like, you know your stuff. Right, you're demonstrating that you have done the requisite research to be able to contribute to this body of knowledge by sort of, I've walked through this path and I know what else has already been done out there, so that now I can make a meaningful contribution. Certainly, if you are writing in an area where there has been a pivotal author and you don't mention that pivotal author, you're going to get feedback that you need to mention that pivotal author, right? That's going to be an automatic kind of like, nope, you missed something here. You missed some important territory that we were looking for. Second is you need to catch the reader up on what is already known about the topic. So many people who are going to be reading your article or your research might not be as familiar with the topic as you are, and you're wanting to bring them up to speed on the ground that you have already covered so that they're prepared for the additional novel contribution that you're going to make. Probably one of the most important reasons, particularly if you're working on a thesis or dissertation, is you are justifying why you need to do the particular research project that you're doing. So in many ways, what you're doing with a literature review is you're saying, here's this whole big puzzle that has already been pieced together by these other people who have talked about this subject, and here's this missing piece here. Look at this little piece that they haven't filled in yet. I'm going to fill in that piece. There's some sort of specific take on this. There's a specific application to a new area. I'm going to do that thing so that I'm adding something else to this bigger puzzle that we're looking at. And it should be a way of identifying the major relationships, patterns in the previous research. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses in the body of research? Again, sort of further justifying why it is that you're doing what it is that you're doing. We also often use it to justify a specific methodology that we're taking. So if you're operationalizing an independent or a dependent variable in a particular way, it's nice to be able to show that other people have done that ahead, before you, so that you're not recreating the wheel unless your contribution is that we need to recreate this wheel because it hasn't been created before. So you're providing context for what it is that's coming after. So everything that you're writing in your lit review should be telling a story that's preparing your reader for this thing that you want to add, so that by the time you get to what you're adding, it completely makes sense, right? It's like, well, of course, that's the only step that we could have taken next because of the way that we have developed this literature review. So, structure. It's kind of like the standard 5-paragraph essay that you were probably asked to write in high school in many ways, right? There are a lot of different types of structures to lit reviews, but essentially you're going to introduce like what it is that you're going to talk about and how it is that you're going to be organized. Lit reviews can be organized in a variety of different ways. So some of them work chronologically. Here's where we started in the field, and then this is what came next, and then we went through this period, and now here's where we are now, right? So your lit review might be this chronological review of where the field has gone. Other lit reviews, often really good lit reviews, are talking about controversies within a particular area of subject. So this camp thinks this part of it, right? Or they all think this is true, and yet there's this whole other camp that thinks this thing isn't true, and here are some of the reasons why there might be differences between these two camps, right? This is probably more likely in social science research than it is maybe in natural science research, where we're still having kind of debate about the importance of some of these independent variables and how they operate. Or it might be outlined like I have outlined. This one is just an example where you're going to first tell me everything we know about the independent variable of interest that you're really looking at. Then you're going to tell me everything you know about the dependent variable that you're looking at. And then you're going to tell me sort of what's the research that's already connected these two things together. So I might be looking at something like the relationship between religious affiliation and party identification, right? So I'm going to first introduce you to, here's what we know about people's religious affiliation and sort of how it varies and what it looks like and the research that's been done there. Here's what we know about party identification and all the various variables that might be related to those things. And then here's the existing research that has already connected these two things together, right? So those might be the camps that I'm looking at. There isn't a magical rule of 3. You could have 4 topics that need to be covered. If you're doing a dissertation as opposed to just a journal article, you might have 6 topics that need to be covered or something bigger than that. So the rule of 3 isn't necessarily magical. Occasionally there's only 2 sort of substantive things that you need to address. But in general, most sort of tend to kind of revolve down to this 3. So your literature review should be organized in that you're giving us a heads up about where you're going, then you're providing the substantive review of each of those areas, and then you're providing a summary of that leads really nicely, usually into your hypothesis or your method section, so that we're prepared again for the research that it is that you're providing. All right, so step 1, this is just where you're reading everything, right? So this is where you've gone out, you found all of the relevant articles, they all look to be relative, at least closely related to what it is that you're looking for. So you have to go in and just get the reading done. That's the first step. A couple of pointers on how to accomplish this step. One is try to avoid those things that are tangentially related. I have horrible attention sort of deficit issues when it comes to, particularly when I'm reading things online and I'm doing research online, that I'll see something that's sort of interesting, even if it's not about what I'm researching at that moment, and then it's like, oh, squirrel, I'm going to go over here. And then like 12 clicks later, I'm watching bunny videos, right? And I've completely forgotten about the research that I was supposed to be doing because I've gone down this rabbit hole online. And so one of the things that I have started doing when I'm sitting down and I really need to focus on my research project project is I keep an open Word document where I just park those things that I'm interested in, but I shouldn't be looking at now, but I'm afraid if I don't look at them now, I'll forget them later, right? And so I just, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to park it here. Later, if I still want to, I can come back and look at this really interesting thing, but it's not going to distract me right now. 9 times out of 10, I never go back and look at those things because they're only interesting because I'm procrastinating the thing I'm supposed to be doing. And so, but it allows me to mentally kind of move on and shift. Definitely make notes and summaries as you go. I still like the old school method of printing everything and making notes in the margins, which isn't a particularly sustainable or efficient way of doing things, but making sure that you're keeping notes about what's important. This might also just be copying and pasting again into sort of another document where you're kind of keeping track of some of the key points that you really want to focus on from that vertical. Make sure if you're doing that, you're properly attributing those so that you know what is direct quotations and what is your summaries as you're going. So if you are doing some copy and pasting, make sure you're putting the quotation marks in there. Look for those seminal articles and authors. So if you have read 6 articles and every one of those 6 articles has mentioned this one author and you haven't come back and read that original piece by that author yet, it's probably a good idea to do so, right? So don't take their word for what this person said or the importance of their work. Go out and find it for yourself because that's going to be one of those things that people are going to be looking for you to have. I have this idea of sort of 15 to 30 articles. This is taken from me suggesting to undergraduate students writing research papers that you're probably going to want to land on that like 10 to 12 actual sources that you're using. So if you want to land on 10 to 12 sources, you should be thinking about 15 to 30 to begin with, because many of those that you're looking at, you're going to decide after you've read them, they don't really fit the story that I'm telling here. They're not really as applicable as I thought they were. Obviously, if you're doing a dissertation, you're looking at a much bigger scope of material here than this, right? But this would be sort of a standard research article. And as we've already talked about a little bit, make sure to use the good sources you find to find other sources that are going to be helpful. Okay, step 2. So if you take nothing else away from what I say today, I hope that you will find this particular tool useful, because this has been the single most useful tool I have found to writing good lit reviews, and good lit reviews that don't look like annotated bibliographies, and that's the lit review grid. So I'm going to show you an example of it, and I think you also have a printed copy of what that actually looks like. And it looks messy and it looks scary when I bring it up here, and it looks like a lot of Excel work that on its surface may seem unnecessarily complicated, but I promise that it provides a great deal of utility in organizing a structure. The essential sort of important pieces of this are that every article that you're reviewing is a row in this Excel spreadsheet. So the articles are here moving down as we go. So you see I have the last name, I have the title of the article, the year in which it was published, the title of the journal. If it's important to me, this may or may not be important depending on the type of research you do. I also might want to talk a little bit about the research design. Are they primarily doing a descriptive study? Are they using some sort of OLS regression or some categorical data analysis? Is it a meta-analysis? So that if I'm going back and making reference later, I can see if there's maybe meaningful differences in methodological approaches. And then I'm going to have, like, what is their specific dependent variable that they're looking at? So most of the research that you're looking at is going to be focusing on the same dependent variable, because that's the thing you're trying to explain, right? Like, that's the thing that all the other things are impacting. But they might be operationalizing it or measuring it in different ways. And so again, you want to capture that nuance or those differences between the articles, because it's also helpful in explaining why they don't agree on their findings, because they're operationalizing things in different ways. So this is a research project you can see at the top, looking at kind of the effect that affirmative action programs have had on increasing the graduation rates of minority students at colleges. So you'll see that when we go to the independent variables, some of the independent variables are these affirmative action policies. But a lot of the other independent variables are just other things that we know might affect minority graduation rates, right, that we're really interested in. So as we move along the spreadsheet, you'll see that the columns over here are all the independent variables. So they're the things that these articles have looked at that they think affect the dependent variable of interest. Now, when I started this project, the spreadsheet's not filled out yet. It's completely blank. I don't know what dependent variables are going to show up yet because I haven't read the relevant research yet, right? So I read that first article, and after I've read that first article here, I'm not going to have all of these other columns. I'm only going to have the columns in them that have X's. So if the article talks about that variable, I'm going to put an X in there. If the article finds that that variable is really important or highly statistically significant, perhaps, then I'm going to shade it orange. If they find that it's sort of important, then I'm going to shade it yellow. So why do we do all of this to sort of create this chart? The real key is that when you kind of back up and you look at what we have here, you can start to identify some meaningful patterns. So if I look for areas where there's lots of X's, but there's not very much color, then I know that's something that we've studied a lot and we haven't found to be statistically significant. We haven't found it to be an important variable. That doesn't mean we maybe shouldn't include it as a control variable, but there's actually not a whole lot of significance placed in the literature on this particular thing. I'm probably not going to talk about it a lot in my literature review. If I go down and find a column like this one here, negative self-image, it's been studied a lot, and it's been found to be important or very important a lot of different times, right? But a lot of different articles have said, hey, this thing here matters. So this is probably an important area that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about, hey, there's substantive agreement in the field that negative self-image can have a significant impact on whether or not minority students graduate. I can just write that sentence. I don't have to have a lot of direct quotes from a lot of individual authors. I can write that sentence, and then every article that I have yellowed this for, I just make sure that I include the citation material for that article after that sentence where I've just summed up what it is we know about that particular variable, right? So I'm moving row by row in my literature review so that I'm moving by ideas as opposed to moving, or I'm sorry, scratch that, moving column by column, right? Because I'm organizing by ideas, rather than moving row by row, which is what an annotated bibliography does, where you're giving me a whole paragraph about what this article found and a whole paragraph about what this author found. That's what we're trying to avoid. So this is one way of helping you to just kind of see like what's really out there. You'll also notice there's some areas like teacher quality over here. We have a couple articles that have looked at it, some of which have found that it's significant, but it's an under-researched area of study. It's something that needs further research, right? So just by looking at this color coding, these X's, I can quickly identify some of those patterns that are there. So play with that. I encourage you to just try using it on your own. Just build it out however makes sense to you, but that's one way of thinking about it. Okay, so you've identified some of these patterns, and then we're going to start fleshing them out into an outline. So we're going to identify like what are the major themes that I'm going to actually talk about. These are the things that had a lot of color, they had a lot of X's. These are the things that are important that I want to look at. I'm going to sort those sources into meaningful topics. The whole Excel spreadsheet you might look at and just say like, yeah, that's so not for me. I'm not going to do that. It's also completely acceptable just to use the bedroom floor method, right? Which is where you have all your articles sort of summarized on note cards and you're sorting them into piles on your bedroom floor, right? These articles, they all talk about this thing. These ones all talk about this thing. And these ones all talk about this. And then you sort of sit on it and you look and you think, can I tell an interesting story using those themes? Maybe it doesn't feel quite natural, it doesn't seem like a really good fit, it doesn't seem like the perfect explanation, shuffle them and resort them again. Right? Try to see if you can find other kinds of ways of organizing the material that makes sense to you. So once you've organized that into a meaningful outline that focuses on the theories and concepts, not the individual authors, then we just start to develop each one of those further. And this is where you want to be careful. This is where you want to make sure that it's your voice that's coming through and you're not just providing a lot of direct quotations from the articles that you're reviewing, right? We don't want it to just be like huge block quote, a couple of your words, huge block quote, a couple of your words, right? We really want it to be your take on what this literature is saying with just kind of, the citations of whose work it is that you're pulling from included there, but not a lot of those original quotations. With one exception, and this I've discovered this semester in working with some literary analysis, if you are in the humanities and your unit of analysis is an actual sort of literary text, then you are going to be using a lot of direct quotes from the literary text, but not maybe in your literature review, right? Like that's where you're going to actually sort of dig down into that. Okay, once the structure is complete and you've fleshed out each one of those themes and you kind of have an idea of what your whole story is, go back and just make sure that you have told a readable and interesting story. You have written a literature review that you would like to read that walks your reader through a path that is interesting, that gets you to the place where you're going to build on that research topic. Remember that your purpose is not only to summarize what is known, but to make sure that you're justifying and positioning that question. Make sure that you've kept your tone professional throughout. There might be a whole kind of body within this field that you're looking at that you don't think is a worthwhile contribution to the field, but make sure you're professional in providing a critique of that material, and we don't slip into being kind of overly critical or dismissive. My recommendation is not to edit as you go. Editing as you go just tends to lead to like a stalemate, right? Where you're just really worried about getting that sentence just right. It's much easier to just write everything down and go back and edit it later. One way that I do this that really helps me is I go to a place where there's not internet access, and I just take my, which is very hard to find these days, but just change a notebook and I write everything out by hand. I write my first draft by hand. And what that does is I know I can't turn in a handwritten draft. I know I'm gonna have to go back and type that later. And so I know that when I go back and type it, I'm gonna edit as I go then, right? So that first time I can just let it be stream of consciousness. I can get all the thoughts on the page. Way easier than looking at that blank screen trying to think of a perfect sentence. Last thing, and this is really, really important, make sure that before you turn it in or before you submit it, whether it be for a class or for a journal or for whatever, have somebody else read it. Because just because it makes sense in your head doesn't mean it's going to make sense in everybody else's. The Writing Center staff is really great for that, to have them take a look to make sure that it's sort of logical and it flows. But it can also be other people who aren't experts. My dissertation, I had my mom and my husband read it, and they know nothing about what I do. But they would go through and just be like, I don't think this is a word, or this sentence doesn't make sense, or you said pubic instead of public policy, right? Like, these are things they can pick up on that I might have missed, and that like Word was not going to pick up on for me. And it makes me go back and think, have I explained this well enough? And a lot of times they would be like, yeah, that's totally a word. People will know that's a word. You just don't. But there were other cases where it's like, yeah, I need to explain that further. I need to do a better job of being able to set that up. So having other people read it, anybody that you can cajole into doing it before you turn it in is definitely useful. I have a few other things, but I want to leave John enough time, so I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'm John Dudley. I'm in the English department, so I am the humanities person here. And as Dr. Nordijk mentioned, what's sort of nice, we've done this a couple times for us, for me anyway, is to see how much we have in common. Really, we do say a lot of the same things in slightly different ways, and thinking about what we choose to emphasize in each of our areas of expertise. So it's kind of an iterative process where I'm going to sort of go back and say a few things that may be repetitive in certain ways, but I think this actually kind of makes sense to be last. And then I want to look at one of the handouts you have there is an example of the first few pages of an article in the humanities, which sort of does some of the things that I'm talking about. So since I'm in English, I'm going to talk in metaphors. This is a picture of the Library of Congress, right? Full of information. It's daunting. There's lots of stuff. It's distracting. It's like a funny video in real life, I guess. It's easy to be lost in that, right? And so the sort of idea that you often see cited when we talk about research is this quote attributed to Sir Isaac Newton, that what we're doing is we're standing on the shoulders of giants when we're doing research, right? You don't need to start at ground zero for research. That's why we do research. Lots of smart people have written lots of smart things, and we should make use of it, right? The trick is finding it and organizing it and communicating it to your reader, right? And that's I think what we're talking about here. Some of the things that are different about the humanities versus the social sciences or the natural sciences. We don't tend to publish standalone literature reviews the way that I think is pretty routinely done, certainly in the natural sciences, I know. And the nature of, they tend to be more embedded within the work that we do when we publish articles. And we tend to assign them to students to have to do, partly because it's, an exercise that's very instructive and you learn a lot about a subject, but also because it is something that we do in our jobs and when we publish articles as well. So even though it's a slightly different way of producing a literature review, it's something that all the disciplines sort of share, and yet there are sort of unique twists to it. We all end up doing this in our own way, right? And one of the things that you need to do when you're facing research is think about, this is another metaphor, lots of metaphors here, like there are many different directions that you could go in when you're looking at a topic, right? And you don't know that you've gone down the wrong one until you go down it a little ways. Usually, right? I mean, that's sort of the trick, right? Is choosing well, but also realizing, well, this isn't really working out. I'm going to go back and try a slightly different route. You need to know what some of the choices are, and of course, you need to rely on other people to help you start going down the right road, right? There isn't really a shortcut to get to the end. You have to go through some legwork to do it. It's one of the reasons that, you know, in my class right now that I'm teaching, the research paper that's due at the end of the semester, that we're working on it now, because that's a process. You can't do it overnight. You can't learn what you need to learn and communicate it to your readers. In the humanities, I think maybe more than the sciences or social sciences, we rely upon the idea that there isn't really one truth, one path. There isn't one way to explain, say, a literary text. There may be many different ways that we might go about it, and some are more valid than others, and some are more useful to us than others. That there isn't a single linear sort of chronological route to the truth. That we have to figure out which of these paths works best for us, and in other words, which shoulders we want to stand on, right? That the conclusions that we're going to arrive at are going to be based on the sources that we choose to use, and how those sources fit together and how they communicate with one another. Next metaphor is, it's daunting when you look at the amount of criticism that's out there, like the search that Dr. Hoffelmeyer did there at the beginning with how many, it was 20,000?
200,000.
It was a ridiculous number, right? Like, you're not going to, if you whatever you start with as your topic is going to be a ridiculous number, right? And so the trick is getting that down to something you can manage and something you can work with. And a lot of that has to do with choosing your topic and refining your topic as you go along. But also, don't just say, well, I'm doing this and I'm sticking to it. I'm not, this is my topic and I want to talk about this. I know it's big, but you've got to go down a path and say, all right, this, I gotta take another side trip here, right? Don't get discouraged, right, at the amount of material that's out there, or your initial search. Maybe the opposite thing is you end up with nothing. Like, I searched and there's nothing on my topic. Well, it's probably not true. It's probably the way you're searching, because there is an awful lot of stuff out there, right? And so one step in this process needs to be working with, say, the reference librarians, other people, experts, your professor, right, to figure out how come I'm not finding the things that I need to find, or how do I refine what I have found into something that's usable, right? And so the other metaphor that I like to refer to is this one of a table, that you're essentially choosing who is going to sit at the table that you are in charge of, right? You're the boss at the head of the table. You're collecting experts and you're putting them in conversation with one another, right? And so I often like to think of this as sort of a conference table. You're the one who gets to call the meeting, who gets to tell everyone when it's time to go and all that stuff, and call on people when it's their turn, right? But you want those voices to be part of the conversation, right? So often research can feel more like a conveyor belt of stuff flying by, or stuff, one person standing on a stage and then exiting the stage and another person coming off. But what you want is more of the conference table, where you can go around and hear from people, but someone can also interject and say, well, that's true, but what about this, right? That the more of a conversation you're presenting in your review of what's out there, the more useful that will be, and the more readable that will be, probably too. The more like a real conversation something is, where you're moving toward a direction, you're moving in a direction toward an objective, but you're allowing for some different voices to enter into the discussion, right? And there are lots of reasons why you might be writing a literature review for an assignment in a course. you know, for a grant proposal, for a research paper, for a thesis or dissertation. You know, those are all, there are different purposes for what you brought those people together to talk about, and who the people are sitting around the table, right? So you have to think about what's not, in other words, not just the first 10 people you meet, right? Do you hire and bring into your office to sit around the table, right? You find the best people, right? You find the ones that are going to be the most useful for the job that you have in front of you, right? And so that's building off of what Dr. Nordyke said about, you know, if you need 10 sources, try 30, right? Like, you're going to have to winnow it down to get to the best stuff, which again is time consuming, and why we're talking about this in October instead of December, right? That probably this is a long process. One of the questions you want to be able to ask when you're putting this together, or you want to really be able to answer, I think, to your readers, is there a critical consensus on this topic or subtopic, whatever it is you're writing about? Maybe there's a couple of critical consensuses. There are a couple big points of contention, right? But that's your primary job, is to figure out what other people have said and how are you going to group them together, like the piles of note cards on your floor or the columns in a spreadsheet. However you group them, you know, you need to present some logic. It's not just, well, and then there's this other thing that happened, oh, and then there's this other one, and then, oh yeah, and then there's this, like, that's not useful, right? You need to say there are 3 main kinds of responses to this. Here they are, right? Or whatever it is. You need to come up with a sort of narrative of your review, right? What are some of the controversies? What are the things that people have disagreed about, right? What are some of the trends that happen over a long period of time? And again, with all of these things, this isn't something you're going to find very quickly or very easily. One of the things you can do, however, is rely on the fact, as with the reviews in the natural sciences that we looked at and from the chemistry example, other people have done this, right? You can use what they've done. You can build on what other people have done in the process of writing their articles. Like, if you find an article on your topic it turns out it's not really useful for your argument, it's not really helpful, you don't agree with it, or whatever it might be, or it might be on a different chapter of the book that you're writing about, or whatever it is, but they have a really nice summary of what everyone else has said about, say, the issue of gender in a particular author's work or something, then make use of that, right? Then build on that and say, well, I'm going to have to go check out some of these sources. Look at the bibliographies that your sources have and use those as a jumping off point for building your own bibliography. And also, what you will see when you look at lots of sources is, who are they citing, right? It isn't as easy in the humanities. Citation indexes are not as widely used. Google Scholar is becoming more widely used and works pretty well. But if you just look at the bibliography of some recent articles on your topic, and you see the same name coming up on every one of them, guess which book you need to look at, right? Like, there you go, right? You may not agree with it, you may not like it, whatever, but you got to talk about it, right? And so that's something you only really get from spending some time looking at different sources. But you will see trends emerging, you'll see patterns, and once you see patterns, that's what you need to communicate to the reader when you write up one of these reviews, right? The nature of the disagreements that people have could be methodological, they could be ideological, they could be theoretical, they could be all sorts of different kinds of disagreements, and explaining what those are is going to be really important, right? Is going to be essential for putting together your review. They sometimes can be over facts, over simple facts. In the example that I'm using today, Stephen Crane, for instance, one of his sort of famous issue in the scholarship on Stephen Crane is that his first biographer, the guy who wrote the first biography of him, this guy Thomas Beer, who's actually mentioned in this article, made up a bunch of stuff, like just literally made stuff up, wrote a bunch of letters himself and pretended they were Crane's and put them in an archive, and just totally messed everything up for everybody else, right? And what the problem is, sort of now it's kind of notorious. So you got to be very careful when you cite this particular scholar because he's not credible. And you notice if someone else cites him, you say, well, you better be careful about this, right? Because we know for a fact that he just literally made up some information. And one of the things about this is that mistakes tend to replicate. It took many years for people to stop citing some of these things and referring to known facts about Stephen Crane that in fact were not true, right? So just because something has been repeated oftentimes doesn't mean that it's necessarily reliable or accurate. It means you need to pay attention to it, but it also means you might need to do a little more digging to find out what's come to light about some of those things, right? And again, there aren't really a whole lot of super easy shortcuts. The best shortcut is to read what others have said in their reviews, in their own literature reviews. And the example we're going to look at in a minute is I think a good example of that. How are you going to organize your review, right? Chronological is an easy way to do it and often makes sense. Starting out from a common starting point and moving up to the present is often a good way to do it. But then you need to choose, as with the sort of the dendrite model, right? You need to make sure you haven't chosen too big of a chunk of that because it's going to get really big. But that is one way to do it. Or are there key turning points in the criticism? You know, one of the things about literature, the discussion of literature, is in many ways we might think it's not as reliant upon timeliness as, say, molecular biology is. Like something written about molecular biology 100 years ago is probably not much use, I'm guessing, as someone who knows nothing about molecular biology. But I'm pretty confident I would want something written pretty recently, right? But maybe something written 100 years ago about Shakespeare is totally viable, right? But there are things that have happened in the last 10 or 20 or 30 years that are important for you to recognize and acknowledge. And if you don't know about them, it's going to sort of stand out. It's not going to be quite as bad as thinking we cure diseases with leeches or something. But it's going to be noticeable, right? So even though timeliness is not exactly the same in the humanities, it's still important to know what the recent trends are and how they are reflected in the criticism and what the real turning points are in the criticism. So when you choose sources, you need to think about the obvious stuff, right? The place and date of publication, the scholarly approach adopted by each author, which often is not explicitly stated when we're talking about literary criticism. I mentioned before how we like to think of, the answer that English teachers always give is there's no wrong answer, which is not actually true. There are some wrong answers. But what we mean is there are many ways to arrive at a useful answer, right? Knowing where something is published, when it was published, what approach someone has taken to the text is really important. If you put a psychoanalytic, say, critic in English next to a feminist critic and just have them both talking at the same time around that table without acknowledging the fact that they have very different assumptions about the way literature works, that's going to be kind of awkward, just as it would be in person. You have to acknowledge, well, I realize, I stipulate that you have a very different view of this, but here's what I think, right? So you have to be aware of their critical approach and take that into account. The number of citations and references to other critical works within the criticism. Again, looking, like when I'm skimming to look at something to see if I want to read it carefully, right? One of the first things I do is look at the bibliography. I go to the end and look and see what that gives you an idea of who they're citing, gives you an idea where they're coming from, what kind of critical or theoretical approach they're taking, and it gives you some insight into what are the shoulders they've chosen to stand on, in other words, right? If you recognize those names and you're like, oh yeah, okay, that's the stuff I've read, then you probably want to use that source. And if there are things you haven't read, you either need to figure out, wow, who are all these people, or you know that, oh, that's not an approach I really want to take to this. But that's really important to know. And the relationship of the sources to one another, which should be explained in, like, often just because you cite something doesn't mean you agree with it. that understanding how the author has positioned him or herself in relation to those sources is going to be really important as well. And so again, as we I think all mentioned, these are not laundry lists of like, and then he said, and then she said, and then he said. Like, that's not how it works. You have to group them together in some way, and you have to understand the relationships that people have. Some people, when you're sitting around your meeting table, shouldn't sit next to each other, for whatever reason, right? Like because they don't get along or they goof around or whatever. Like it's sort of the same with this. You need to understand where each person fits in this conversation that you're sort of the metaphorical conversation that you're creating, right? And if something again is cited frequently, especially if something is older. Something's from like, this makes me feel really old when I say the 1980s, because like I remember the 1980s, and it doesn't seem old, but there you go. But it's not? Okay, good. But if something from the 1980s is still being cited regularly, it's probably pretty important, right? If it's still kicking out there, right? If something's from the last few years, it may be gone in 20 years, right? So, and again, this is going to vary on the discipline and certainly whether we're talking about sciences or humanities. When you incorporate information in your paper, this is sort of like people in a job interview who say they're hardworking. Like, who says they're not, right? But write clearly and concisely. Write unclearly and ramble on. Nobody's going to say that. But keep in mind, because you're going to have a lot of information, right? And I always like to remind people, and I'm pretty confident about this because USD is the smartest place in South Dakota, that when you pick a topic to write a paper on here, or certainly a thesis or dissertation or an honors thesis or whatever it is, you are going to know more about that topic than anyone in the state of South Dakota. I guarantee it. Because you're going to spend a lot of time reading what other people have said, and by the time you're done with it, you're certainly going to know more than I do about it. I'm going to help you get there if I'm directing it or working with you. But so to get to that place, you're going to have tons of information sloshing around in there. And you need to be very clear and concise in how you use that information. And so as with the example from the spreadsheet, right, where you can say, I can say definitively there's a lot of consensus on this particular issue. That only takes you one sentence to say it. You can't say that sentence without hours and many hours maybe of work, to confidently say that, right? But you need to say it. You need to be clear, and you need to synthesize the information into something new, into something that presents a claim about those sources. If you say there are 3 types of approaches to this issue or whatever it is, of course, like anytime we do that, it's a rhetorical trick. When you say there are 2 kinds of people who like dogs and people who like, no, that's not the way the world works. But you're making a point. You're categorizing to make an argument. So you're doing that in an essay as well, or in a literature review. You're grouping things. You're thinking systematically about lots of information in order to make your reader understand a point you want to make about that information, right? And so obviously you begin by introducing things, as one often does in the introduction, right? And explain, why is this worth discussing? Why is this something we need to be talking about, right? So the example, and this is one of the handouts that you've got in front of you, and I sort of have highlighted on here some of the sentences, some of the sections of the paper. And if you look at the first sentence of each paragraph, basically, I mean, one of the things that I like to remind people about using sources is use them for the information that they're providing you as a source of content, right? But use them as also for their form, like imitate them, right? This is a published article. So this is about Stephen Crane's story, The Monster, which you can read the summary there if you're interested. It's a great story. It's interesting. But we're not here to talk about that. This is an interesting article about technology and electricity specifically in The Monster and what it means, the sort of meaning of it in the context of the issues of race and technology and modernity that it's discussing. But it's also a really well-written, because it's in a Arizona Quarterly, which is a very prestigious journal. It's written really well, and it's doing even though what someone does in a book or someone does in a published article and what you're doing in a paper in a class or even in a thesis or dissertation may seem like different projects. Writing is writing, right? And you can learn from what other people do. Sometimes you learn when something isn't very good. But often with published articles, at least somebody thought this was good, right? So look at the form and how it works. And so one of the things I like to point out here is to just look at the first sentences of each of the paragraphs, right? So you have 4 pages there, and I think 4 or 5 different paragraphs. And if you look at the topic sentences, they kind of tell you a story about the essay, what's happening in the essay. And really what we have here is about 3 paragraphs of literature review embedded in a 20-page paper, right? So this is more typical of how humanities literature reviews might work, right? And I'll talk about the topic sentences in a second here. But the first one, so I think this zooms in, it does. Stephen Crane's 1898 novella, The Monster, is among the most cryptic and most ruthless of his works. In brief, it tells the story, blah, 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 blah. So it starts out with it's cryptic and ruthless. That sounds interesting. I want to read more. It gives us a summary of the text, what's going on in the text, and it leads up to the main sort of point that the author wants to make, a narrowing of the topic. As this passage suggests, Crane's novella is just as interested in the residents of the fictional town of Wylandville as it is in the character at the center of the uproar. They are the ones who label the living Henry Johnson an undead thing, and thus represent the true creators. Whoops. Well, I'm not going to read that paragraph just yet, I guess. What's happening there is it's narrowing the topic to get down to the thesis, the point that it wants to make. The other things to think about here, and then I'll go back to the handout. Structure your summary of what other people have said, your literature review, around trends and themes, and not around people, right? Not say, person 1 said blah, 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 and person 2 said blah, blah, like that's not a structure, that's just a laundry list, right? Evaluate the sources in terms of their relevance to your argument. There may be really interesting things that people said, but they're not, or they may be really well written. You're not evaluating them on how good or bad they are, how much you like them. You're evaluating them on how relevant they are to the point you're eventually going to make when you make your argument. And then, and this mirrors, I think, a lot of what Dr. Nordyke said, you're making space for yourself at that table, right? You're saying, here's the spot that I need to be sitting in. Here's the question that hasn't been answered, right? And that sounds like a big thing to do when you're citing all these experts and standing on their shoulders, but that's what you're doing, whether you're writing a paper or a thesis or a book or whatever. If it's worth writing, you have to explain what that space is that you're occupying, right? So if we go back to the example, it summarizes the text, and then it leads up to sort of an initial thesis statement. Crane's novella makes it possible to ignore the fact that the person at the center of the controversy is an African-American man in a largely white small town. That's not really the thesis. It's sort of a tentative stab at a thesis, right? And then what it's going to do is, it literally says is, this issue has deservedly been at the center of recent scholarly interest in the monster. And now it's saying, here we go, welcome to the literature review, right? It doesn't say that exactly, but it pretty much says that, right? And if we look at the topic sentences of the paragraphs, they're very clear about what's going on. So the topic sentence, this is the second paragraph of the article. Soon after its publication, critics began to speculate about what could have possibly inspired the monster's narrative of alienation in small-town America and the vivid and disquieting imagery used to describe Henry Johnson, right? So it's going back in time, saying right after it was published, people already were speculating about this. Why write about this event in this small town? What is he saying about small-town America? And what is the story about? And then this is the guy Thomas Beer that I mentioned, who's the guy who made up stuff. John Berryman is a well-known poet, also a biographer of Crane. So it's going back to really old criticism, 100 years ago in some cases, and sort of giving us an overview of this is what people said initially about the work, right? And I'm not going to read all that. It's very good, but we're out of time. Next paragraph, right? Bill Brown's 1996 study, and see, that seems really recent to me, and then I stop and think, and I go, oh my gosh, Seinfeld was still on. The material unconscious, American amusement, Stephen Crane and the economies of play greatly expanded the historical and cultural context for Crane's novella. So it's a name, it's starting with a name, which is sort of a no-no maybe in a topic sentence, but not really, because it's saying this is a turning point in the criticism. lots of stuff happened between 1920 something with Thomas Beer and 1996. But this article is saying this is the thing. This is a really important turning point in the criticism of this story, right? And it spends this whole paragraph sort of summarizing what Bill Brown's argument is, right? And then the next paragraph, right? In the late 1990s, separate essays by Elaine Marshall and Price McMurray forced Crane critics to rethink the supposed innocence of Port Jervis. And that's a little bit after the Bill Brown essay in the late 90s, 1998, I think is one of them. And it's saying, here's some other articles that further complicate our ideas about race and technology in this story, right? And so if you look at like those three topic sentences, they're really clear. It's established a chronological structure, and it's established a very important turning point in the criticism, and then said that there were two articles that came out very near each other that forced everyone to rethink this issue, right? Now, in order to say that, forced Crane critics to rethink, like you have to do some, you can't just make that up, right? So I happen to have read enough of the criticism to know that that's right. You know, that it's pretty hard to see any, like nowadays, if you write an article, if I gave a paper on this story, and I had to cite these people, right? Because that's what you have to do, right? But you're not going to know that 5 minutes after you do your Google search, right? You have to spend some time researching that, right? And then the next paragraph begins with really a more developed thesis statement. That's a refining of that initial tentative stab at a thesis in the introduction. And this is, we can look at it, it's a good thesis statement. In the following essay, I hope to continue the work of locating the monster's narrative and its highly stylized language in relation to fin de siècle in New York, and in particular Port Jervis. Specifically, I will focus on the role of electricity in the monster, as it is this technology that embodies modernization in the small town of Wallingford, right? So that literature review was necessary to sort of elbow the space to say, I'm going to talk about this small town, but I'm going to talk about this very specific issue of electricity. And elsewhere in here, just down a little ways, it says, I think, as in those novels, electricity in the monster is far more than simply an atmospheric detail. Like if you had started out saying, hey everybody, I got a paper on electricity, it's great, and say that doesn't sound that interesting, right? Like he had to do all this stuff first in order to say, to have us say, oh, electricity, that's important, that's interesting, right? And so that's why you do a literature. You're carving out the space to say it isn't just about, it isn't a coincidence that he's writing about a town that just got electric lights. Turns out they're really important to the argument. Of course, then he spends 15 pages defending that, right? But first he has to sort of talk about what the other critics have said to sort of justify that topic of conversation, right? So I will conclude with sort of one more metaphor here, I guess, right? Which is that you part of what you're doing in your literature review is describing where you've been and how you got there and where you're going, right? And so that journey through the forbidding mountains that I showed before, right? Once you have done that, that's maybe not a totally unique path, but it's gotten you somewhere, hopefully, that other people haven't exactly been, right? And you're hopefully extending that path a little bit further down into the sort of wilderness of confusion that's out there, right? I think that's my last thing. Yes, it is. So that was kind of fast talking there. Questions? Anyone have any questions about specifically this, or I think we could just say if there are questions for any of us at this point and turn it over to that.
So yeah, so let's say I'm done with my review. I just completed my review article, but somehow I missed an important piece of information. So how I will place that information on that review? I mean, I always find it's very difficult for me. I mean, to find a very suitable place to place that information.
So you mean you've turned it into the publisher, or
no,
it's
no,
like you're just like you've done it, and
yeah.
you're okay, because then you're like, yeah, it's different. I mean, I don't have to be the one to answer this, I guess. Yeah, I think that can be tricky. And one of the things, before I'm not answering your question. One of the frustrating things about research is, as soon as you're done, you immediately find something that's like, oh man, how did I not know about this, right? And you could do that forever because of the amount of stuff that's out there, right? So first of all, you can't let that worry you too much, right? But if you know this is something that other people have talked about and you need to incorporate it, you sort of, I mean, it's sort of like with that table. Where do you make room? Where does this belong? Is it something you can put a footnote in and sort of interject it in there? How does it fit with the other pieces? Which paragraph does it go with? Sort of depends on how long it is or how many sort of tangents that might be already coming up along the way. But I think the first thing is to decide, do I really have to? You can't account for everything, right? And like in that one we were just looking at, the author says, many articles have had to contend with this. Like, it doesn't actually go through all of them, right? It does actually have footnotes that may direct you to, like, for instance, see the following. You're not sort of under oath to provide all the relevant information, right? But if it is something that really turns out to be important, then it's just a matter of figuring out what category, how do I fit this into the system that I've created, right? Which could be a spreadsheet or whatever it is, right? How does it fit? I don't know if you guys want to add to it.
I'll just on that a little bit. I mean, some of it really depends on what the nature of the contribution is based on what you already have, right? So one possibility is that it's a new piece that belongs in one of your piles, right? And you're like, oh, right, this is an example of this thing. It belongs in this pile. So that's the paragraph I should talk about it in. And in that case, there's one of two options. It might be saying the exact same thing that two of your other authors have already said. So then you're not really adding any text. You're just adding a name and a citation list, right? Oh, he's in the camp with these three guys who've already said this thing. So I just need to add his name here. I don't need to add even any more description or sort of narrative stuff that's there. Or he's in that same camp, he's in that same sort of paragraph, but he's taking a slightly novel take. He added something a little bit different. He added some additional contribution. So that's maybe a sentence or two about that article that I need to add to that paragraph. The other possibility is that he doesn't neatly fit into any of your piles, right? And if it's something so different that you're completely rethinking your piles, well, then that's like worst case scenario, right? Because then you're like sort of thinking about a whole rewrite. More likely, it's just like either like a footnote, where you're just like, well, this isn't really, like, this is an important work, but it doesn't really fit, into this discussion that we're having here. Or you're creating that fourth paragraph, right, where you're saying, and also, here's this whole other thing that I needed to look at, and maybe I need to do a little bit more research to see if anybody else also said this thing that this guy I just found actually said, so that I can flesh that out, right? So there's not a unique answer for like how you fit it in, because it really depends on where that person fits in at your table, right? Like where they fit into that larger conversation. It could be as easy as adding one name into one citation, or it could be as bad as like rethinking your whole structure.
But hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Does that sort of get at what you're asking?
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
I don't know if this is discipline specific or not, but I'm trying to go into the sciences, and I've had to do a mock, more or less, review paper before. What I was told during that assignment was to try as hard as possible not to use other reviews. Is that only for certain sciences, or is it just for that professor? To basically go to the primary literature instead of the secondary literature, and use that as your foundation as opposed to what other people have kind of reviewed before.
I would suggest that the reason you had that feedback was because this is an exercise to help you build the skills to write a review. And they wanted you to cite the primary literature and construct a document based on the primary literature and not so much on the review literature, right? So if you're citing a whole bunch of review literature, we know that this topic exists, but what we don't know is how you can take the direct sources, the actual studies on the frontiers of science, and synthesize them into a sort of contemporary review argument. So that's usually why you see those kinds of feedback statements, because you're writing a really focused document. Now, if you're writing something a little bit larger, like the introductory component of your thesis, you will probably need some pointers to define the boundaries of your topic, and you might point to reviews to say, this exists, we're not talking about it. These reviews exist, they're related, and what we're going to do is expand in this direction. And then you start going into the primary literature in that direction where you want to really expand things in a lot of detail. So
there's also the difference between like, so reading the reviews should be like a good first step where you're figuring out like, okay, here's a way of organizing, like here are, ways of talking about this, and they should be good source material for you to think about how you want to structure it, how you want to organize it, what are the major camps, what are some of the major ideas. What they're probably telling you not to do is if you're talking about Smith, you don't want to talk about John who talked about Smith, you want to go back and talk about Smith, right, and sort of find that original work. So if in your actual lit review, you want to make sure you're going back to those primary sources so that you're talking about them directly from what it is they said, as opposed to saying so-and-so said that so-and-so said, right, in terms of how you're talking about them. But that shouldn't dismiss them as being a useful resource to you as you start to do your own literature review, because they're good kind of background material for you to get the lay of the land.
Another thing that's not really that question, but in the humanities comes up, because we actually do deal with books still, real, actual, sometimes physical books. That someone will, I'll say, oh, you should really check out this book, or they'll find a book on their topic, and it's big, and they don't have that much time to read every possible book, right? Look at book reviews, like look at scholarly book reviews, right? Not in the New York Times, but in a scholarly journal, because mostly what academic book reviews are summaries of the text. And then you'll see, oh wow, chapter 3 is what I really need to look at. I'm going to go look at that, or you'll see, not so much like this is. Sometimes they'll say this is a terrible book, but usually they don't. But you'll say, this isn't really on my topic. It looks like it is, but it's really not. And that it feels like cheating to do that a little bit, but it's totally not, because you're standing on the shoulders of other people who've done some of this work. You still need to go look at the book and cite it and quote directly from it, right? And you still need to read it and make sense out of it. But that can help you decide which books to look at.
It's kind of like this would be a horrible metaphor, but right, like if you're hiking, right, and like somebody else has like posted pictures of like, pivotal turns along the way, right? Like, oh, hey, when you get here, make sure you turn here in order to be able to get there, right? So, like, if you're using those to determine the path that you're going to take, that's great. But if you used that guy's picture to, like, post on Facebook and be like, oh, look at this beautiful hike I took today, right? Like, and you weren't actually there and didn't actually experience it, you didn't take the picture, you're using their picture, right? Like, that's the difference. Like, use theirs to help you sort of figure out the path that you're going, but make sure that when you get there, it's your take, that it's what's showing up in your literature.
You still got to take the hike.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll give you like an exaggerated example, just so.
Could we have you use that mic? Just hold down the button and then we can make sure that we're here all
You
here.
hear me? Oh,
Yep.
okay. So, good evening. I'll take an exaggerated example just to make my point. For example, if you want to talk about the role of the state, let's say, in a particular issue, you can say a controversy, you can do it chronological. The way you start, you can start talking about Plato and Aristotle, they have different views. Women and binding against stone, you can say, or you can say, let's say, John Locke versus Karl Marx, or the role of the state. Or if you're talking, let's say, about the role of the state to say, it has to speak itself, you might just start about specific literature that just talks about one point of view saying that like the state should not intervene, and one, but let's say like contemporary Iowa, South Dakota. So like, where should you start? Like, how informed should you assume that your audience is, and you get my question.
My take would be go for the jugular. Where's the origin of the idea? What are the key forces that build the idea that you want to go after? And then I think that's the way I would start in organizing information.
I mean, it's really comes back to like what's necessary to justify what it is that you're going to do with it, right? Like what's that conversation that you're having? So if you're talking about the role of the state and what you're really talking about is Iowa and South Dakota in ensuring preparedness for natural security disasters, or like natural disasters types of things, right? Then you don't need any mention of Plato or Aristotle or any of those, right? Like you're going back too far because you're really talking about like a very limited sort of scope, and you're going to want to dig into all the people talking about that thing specifically. But if you are writing a philosophical paper and you're talking much more kind of esoterically or theoretically about sort of like, you know, what is the role of the state, then you're not going to want any of that stuff that's talking about applied specific roles. Instead, you are going to be building on, you know, on those. So again, what's the story you want to tell? And there, you're going to have to subjectively make decisions based on where you want to take the reader in what's going to be important to tell that story.
Yeah, and I think, you know, so like looking at the example I was using, the article, if it had started with electricity is really fascinating. You know, electrical power came to New York State in 1893 and was like, I would have stopped reading, right? It established why that thing was worth reading about. So, but it's going to depend. Maybe there's some really like other literary examples. We'll start with a really exciting scene from a text, you know, and say, let's look at that. And like this raises a really, if we're talking about, you know, the power of the state, you might talk about something in current events that highlights that issue and use that as a jumping off point. This shows us the three main problems that we face in society about blah, 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 something like that, right? So I think there are lots of, and you sort of think of them as tricks or something, but they're not tricks. They're ways to get your narrative sort of started. And I think we tend to think of things as narratives in English, but you know, everything, what you're doing is constructing a structure, right? And there are lots of ways to do that, and they will have structural integrity. And so part of that is tough though, figuring out where do I start? What part of this big jigsaw puzzle do I focus on? But there are lots of different answers to that, I guess.
And some of it depends on your audience and where you plan to publish it, or who it is who's actually going to be receiving it, because that will completely change what you can assume they already know, right? And so if you are putting it in like a state policy journal or something, right, then you're having some assumptions. That paper is going to be very different from the same topic published in a political philosophy journal, right? Like totally different assumptions on what it is people are knowing in those audiences. So some of that will dictate what you include too. I think there was a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm in the field of social science and psychology, so mainly regarding journal articles and grant application. For example, I guess my confusion is sometimes don't know when to stop the literature search, feeling like swimming in the ocean without knowing when to stop. And also, I don't know if you can touch upon a little bit about how to synthesize all the literature. These two questions.
Well, I think two answers, because you mentioned grant applications, right, as a part of it. And usually your when to stop is when you've reached your page, your word limit, right? Because grant applications are very, very particular about you get this many words. So, you know, you got to just like be very concise and focus it in there. But like to your larger question, I think it's when you start to feel like, yep, we've already done this. Yep, we've already done that, right? Like once you start to feel that there's some redundancy and like, oh, here's another person saying this other thing, right, that I've looked at, then you can start to decide like, all right, I kind of have the basic arguments and the basic things that are here. There's a possibility that you might leave this other person out, right, that's going to sort of show up later. But once you've done that pretty good canvas, you followed up on the works that they have cited and also some of the people that have cited them, and you're starting to see like you have the lay of the land, then it is kind of hard to just sort of say, right, I'm done. I'm just going to sort of cut this off here. But usually some sort of external deadline or word limit or some other thing, right, just sort of forces you to be like, right, I'm done. And there's always going to be something you're going to leave out.
Yeah. That's sort of like the ocean metaphor, since I brought up all the metaphors. But, you know, like if you were going to summarize what kind of things live in the ocean, right? You could go on forever because there's like, look at all those, oh, there's another cool fish. But if you said, well, there's you know, things with gills, and there's mammals, and there's sea anemones, and I don't know what all the, like, if you put them into like 6 or 7 or 8 groups of things, you could stop, you know, and like that would account for pretty much everything, even though there's lots of cool examples of each of those. So that's kind of what you're doing is like, what are the groups that you need to identify? And then within those, you're not going to necessarily identify every possible permutation of that. You just want to establish that you've done the legwork to know what those major groups are. Right?
Probably in a technical article, if you can't explain, if you can't produce the introduction in 2 to 4 paragraphs, I would say you've already gone too far. It's usually pretty quick. And then your introduction will probably have on the order of, I would say, 40 citations already in that 2 to 4 paragraphs. Most of them pointers to key points of literature where people need to be reading these to have a firm understanding of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and research is also, one more metaphor, sorry, is like reducing a sauce or something. Like you're finding all these sources and then you're like refining it down and down. And it feels like I've got all these great sources and I'm not even using them, and it's sort of frustrating. But that's like, welcome to research. Like you're going to know all this stuff. That's what you're showing is the tip of the iceberg of all this information you have. But in order to make that tip of the iceberg credible, you need all that stuff under it. That's sort of, it's in footnotes or it's and maybe not even there.
I would say, particularly for undergraduates, and as you transition into more graduate level writing, one of the things that I see is there's kind of like, it's the result of 2 previous things that come to pass. One is like the existence of page minimums, right? And so all throughout high school and your early undergraduate classes, you're like, how do I get to 10 pages? There's just not enough to say, right? So you learn how to be like, pull out your thesaurus and be verbose and take a sentence that could be 8 words and turn it into 20, right? And you're just sort of like, how can I stretch this? And then at some point, right, like once you get into like actually like publishing your work and doing your own research, it's usually the opposite. You're usually dealing with page maximums, and you're usually trying to take all of this stuff and condense it down into that thing. And part of the reason that's uncomfortable is we want people to see, I swam the entire ocean. How are you going to see that I swam the entire ocean if I only give you 4 paragraphs? Because then it looks like I didn't work very hard because I only produced 4 paragraphs. Except that we know that like months of research went into you producing those succinct, well-written 4 paragraphs, but it doesn't feel like it because it didn't take that long to actually write it out, right? So it's the different, like you think that if you've done 6 months of research on reading about that topic and you've read 100 different articles, that it should be as long as it possibly can so that you're proving to people, look at all this work I did, right? But it's not. It's that I did all that work and then I was very careful and thoughtful about the meaning of that work and the importance of that work, and I was able to turn it into something sort of beautiful and concise that now you don't have to do that work to be able to understand. But I think that's the trick, right? Sort of figuring out, like, because we feel like we just need to show we did everything.
Yeah, I think just a quick point to add is the worry is that is wow. Maybe my voice should be loud enough. But anyway, yeah, I'm saying that like, is it okay to just miss some important authors? Because I feel like the sense of trying to be exhausting the major authors. What if I miss this, and then will it lead to serious critique or whatever? Is it okay to miss some? Because I don't think if it's working under a deadline, or if it's a new field for me, I don't think it could exhaust all the important authors in the history.
It's my number one fear in writing is that I miss something and that I'm going to get called out on it, or I inadvertently make somebody upset, or I just look like I'm uneducated. Yeah, it's a natural fear, I think.
But you're going to leave something out. You have to, right? Because you can't cover everything. Hopefully what you're not leaving out is the person who's reviewing your article, which you don't know who that's going to be. But hopefully it's not their work that you've left out, right? And usually, I mean, this is the beauty of science, right? And like its collective collaborative nature is someone's going to point out, you left that out, and they're going to publish another piece and say, oh, hey, by the way, let's bring this person in, right? And that's the beauty of it.
And
it's never the last chance.
When you are publishing, I mean, that's the feedback you often get is like, you need to look at this, And so that's most, at least when you're getting to the stage of publishing, you're not getting graded. You're just getting allowed to be published or not, right? So someone will say, you know what? I mean, no one's trying to trip you up. In other words, really, they're trying to help you and say, this is great, but you need to find that you need to account for this other thing. It's not like F. It's here. Let me help you. So although that is what keeps us up at night is you forget some really important source there. So welcome to research.
Thank you. That was fabulous.
Thanks, everybody.
So, you're welcome to stick around for any additional questions here. Comment cards are being distributed, and I'm going to give the distance students a survey link. Thank you again.
No,
Really a lot of ideas.
I don't do it because I don't want to review them.
I
don't want to see
Okay, I came here for an actual class, but how would I tell her? You just fill out the form.
If it was really
Tell her that you were here if she needs compliments.
Yeah, if it was just on this case. Well, then I would, yeah.
Right? And their first paper they cite is whether or not like practice provides enough foundation for implementing, and so they have to like do a layering analysis. It was so funny.